Sometimes you just miss the old version of something. Oftentimes it's our first experience with something that really hits the hardest and is the most impactful on us. And if you're a fan of fashion designer Rick Owens, you probably know that there are two main eras of Rick Owens' work. And me personally, I became a fan of Rick Owens in that first earlier era. I really came to love and respect his design, his sensibilities, his philosophy when he was in that older era, which is why I gotta say, I miss the old Rick. And I am not alone in this sentiment. There are plenty of Rick Owens fans who really miss the old Rick. And I wanna talk about that today. But before we get into this, disclaimer. I actually don't hate the new Rick Owens stuff. To be quite honest with you all, I actually really like the new Rick Owens stuff. No, this video is not going to be new Rick bad, old Rick good. But with that out of the way, let's just get right into the video. At first here, I want to talk a little bit about the history of Rick. But if you didn't know, I have a really robust video on the history of Rick Owens that you can go watch up here. But for those of us who don't want to go click off and watch a whole new video, here's a quick abbreviated version. Rick Owens was born in California, and he got his start in fashion working as a pattern maker in pretty much a factory that made knockoff designer pieces. A lot of people don't realize that Rick got his start making those one-to-one reps. All jokes aside, after a couple of years of working in this knockoff factory, he transitioned to working for Michelle Lamy. Michelle Lamy was a restaurateur who decided to transition from her successful restaurant to making her own fashion line, which is not the most natural of business transitions. And eventually, Rick ended up working for Michelle Lamy's fashion line. Michelle very quickly noticed Rick in the sense that he was very talented, but also in a romantic sense, and Michelle and Rick actually became lovers, which is a serious HR violation, but I digress. From there, they eventually got married. Michelle decided that Rick should start his own fashion line because he was so talented. And besides being romantic partners, they also became business partners. Michelle ended up funding her husband Rick's own fashion line in 1994. The first 10 years of Rick Owens' fashion line was really spent slowly perfecting the style. Rick sold in small boutiques around the United States, but it wasn't until 2003, almost 10 years after he started the brand, that Rick Owens' talent was really starting to get noticed. Vogue ended up discovering Rick and helped him get his own runway. His come up from getting his first runway in 2003 has been pretty natural, and now he is one of the most popular designers out there. When we talk about the history of Rick's come up and life, one key detail that people don't tend to talk about when it comes to Rick is his relationship to alcohol. Rick has been pretty open about the fact for 10 years of his life he struggled as an alcoholic. This era in which he was an alcoholic was from the era about right when he started his brand, and he thankfully sobered up pretty much right before his first runway collection. Because Rick sobered up and got clean before he really hit the spotlight, we really don't think of Rick as an alcoholic in these conversations. However, I do think Rick's relationship to alcohol and his alcoholism is really pivotal into understanding his work. There was this massive shift in his design philosophy from one era to the next. The first era of Rick's work lasted from around 2003 to 2019. These 16 years, which I am going to call the first era, stretch from his first runway show to around the show Larry. In 2003, when Rick really came onto the scene, he called his style and his work glunge because he believed his work was really a mix of grunge and glam. But if we were to look at the first 16 years of his work, you could especially understand that this first era is more gothic, monastic, and on the glunge scale, you're seeing more of a grunge look rather than a glam look. Rick Owens' runway work is always going to be considered avant-garde. So when we look at his shows, no matter what, across all eras, it's always going to be somewhat out there. But the truth of the matter is most people don't experience Rick just through his runways. They actually consume his clothes. And most of the clothes that people consume aren't the clothes that are on the runway, but rather from his more consumable lifestyle products like Dark Shadow. You have to remember, even Rick Owens didn't start by making avant-garde pieces. The reason he kind of rose to the top was because he was great at making leather jackets that fit super well and were easy to style and wear. And so when we look at that first era, we have to really keep in mind, the people who were into Rick really liked Rick for this sense of wearability. And a whole cult following became interested in Rick, particularly a lifestyle or a subculture known as health goth. Health goth is pretty much for people who were goth at one point, but now they're trying to get healthier in a sense. Maybe they work a corporate job, and while they still want to express themselves and their alternative values, probably also looking to come off as more mature, refined. Picture a dude who used to be punk or goth, but like now is completely sober. They work at Meta and are probably like a vegan who's just really dedicated to working out, which is pretty much Rick. Rick himself went from being an alcoholic to being someone who is obsessed with working out and his health. So it's no surprise that Rick Owens was popular with this subculture. Rick shared the values of discipline, restraint, and borderline monasticism. And besides sharing these values with the community, this discipline, which I talk about that Rick really values, didn't just make its way into the gym or with this community, but it also made its way into the clothes. And what I mean by that is when you look at a lot of the Rick pieces that were coming out in this era, and you look at the small details and attention to design, the discipline really becomes evident. In this era, Rick really perfected a lot of the silhouettes he worked with, in the sense that Rick would spend a lot of time making sure the pieces he produced really complemented the wearer's body. A lot of the jackets in this era were tailored to fit the body as well as a high quality suit would fit the body. To make a denim jacket that complements the body in the same way that a suit would complement the body is actually insane. And that requires a lot of discipline, skill, and time investment. And yes, of course, Rick Owens had some very avant-garde pieces from this first era, but the majority of clothes were more practical than you would think. A lot of the clothes that Rick Owens was making actually naturally accentuated the wearer's body. There is this famous quote from Rick Owens in this era where he said he designed every jacket so that you could fit a sandwich in one pocket and a passport in the other, which is kind of giving the kid who would keep his snacks in his pockets at school and would always be sticky. But the point is, he really tried to make pieces that were interesting but weren't a hindrance to your daily life or lifestyle. The pieces he made, even though they oftentimes looked unconventional, had some function to them. Another quote from Rick during this era on his design philosophy was, "I like discipline and the idea of restraint. I was always anti the whole moving and manipulating the body around. It's like telling someone that their body isn't right and needs to be redone. When I make clothes, it's about using bias cut, jersey, and drape around the body. It always has been important to me that clothes are somehow affectionate. I try to make clothes the way Lou Reed does music, with minimal chord changes. It's about giving everything I make a worn, softened feel." What Rick is really saying with these quotes is that he was very disciplined in his design philosophy to make clothes that were perfect for the wearer. That the wearer would have such a pleasant experience with not only the aesthetics of the clothes, but also the quality. He would spend a lot of time working with the same silhouettes or concepts and being really disciplined in making them better and better. Now, when we think of people who are recovering alcoholics like Rick, discipline is often a safety mechanism for them. It's almost always a positive force in their life, as it drives them to change their life and maintain a healthy lifestyle. Discipline is the reason that Rick was able to quit drinking. But these safety mechanisms like discipline that we have in our life can also sort of have a shadow side. And intense discipline especially can often lead to an individual being more risk adverse than they should be. And in the case of creatives, this often leads to them limiting their own creativity. This brings us to the second Rick era. Rick had been, again, designing this point for about 16 years. And it's somewhere in around 2019 where we see Rick's work really start shifting. It starts with his runway show, Babel. By Larry, you're really starting to see that shift more clearly. And then by Kapital, you're really seeing the new era of Rick in full swing. Now, this is still very much signature Rick, right? this is still his signature design philosophy. But if we're using that grunge scale, that first era of Rick is mainly grunge with a little bit of glam. In this second era, we're starting to see more glam with just a little bit of grunge. The scale has shifted, and so we really just start seeing Rick embrace glam. Pretty much all of that restraint that Rick showed in that first era that made his work have this sense of modesty or monasticism is replaced by vibrance, ostentatiousness, or flamboyantness. The Rick Owens that we know today in the second era makes the Rick of the first era look like a minimalist. Rick is certainly comfortable with pushing the boundaries that he had previously set himself, which dominated the first 16 years of his work. And instead, he's allowing himself to just dive into this sort of limitless, full creativity. In this new era of Rick, we're seeing a lot of different new bright color choices. He is exaggerating the body way more than he ever did previously. Like, look at these inhuman shoulders. He is using exotic and strange fabrics and leathers. He is doing crazy washes and absolutely insane distressing. All these changes go beyond just aesthetic, but also into the practicality side of Rick's clothes as well. You have the kiss heels, which really become the staple item and the core shoe that most of his designs are designed around. And the thing we have to note about it is this shoe is anything but practical. It's actually really difficult to wear kiss heels day to day, which really show a shift in Rick's design philosophy and the items he's more comfortable putting out. For Rick's sort of pivotal signature item to be so impractical goes totally against this prior deep-held philosophy. So why did this happen? Well, it's because of this guy, Tyrone Dillon, who Rick calls his muse. But Tyrone is much more than that. He's also Rick's boyfriend, who he takes on the most lavish dates imaginable while his wife sits at home. And if you don't believe that this guy is the main reason, Rick has literally put him as the lead model of every single runway for the past 5 years, since this new era has started. I mean, Rick even did one whole presentation that was just Tyrone as the model. So to say that Tyrone would be important to Rick is an understatement. Tyrone is a lot less disciplined than Rick is. And that's not me throwing shade at him. I think he's just a lot more of an easygoing guy. He strikes me as the guy who just kind of hops from festival to festival like Burning Man. At some point, maybe he lived in a van, probably surfed. He seems like he's someone who likes to party, to say the least. But I would not describe him as someone who is disciplined, no shade. And I think it's safe to say that this sort of lack of discipline that Tyrone had really challenged Rick's own discipline. And he probably discovered that his own discipline, while keeping him safe, was also limiting him and his creativity. And so when Rick Owens pushed the boundaries of his own restraint a little bit and started giving into this sort of energy Tyrone carried of a chaotic, glamorous party lifestyle, you really see Rick become a much more creative designer. When you look at Rick Owens shows today, Rick is really so much more creative and frankly a lot more interesting. He is way more layered in his references. He's more innovative and creative about using innovative and experimental fabrics. He's more interested in creating a wider variety of original silhouettes and patterns. And frankly, his newer shows are a lot more meaningful. I am much more interested in the runways that Rick has done in this new era for the past 5 years than really anything he has put out in the first era as far as runway goes. So overall, there's a lot of positive things from Rick in this new era, as far as from a creative and artistry standpoint. However, from a consumer standpoint, and from someone who really enjoys Rick as not only art, but also a brand and something that they might consume and wear in their lifestyle, Rick making Tyrone as his muse has not all been a net positive. When Tyrone became Rick's muse, there is this very strong sense that Rick started designing more for Tyrone than he was for his core customer base. And this has started to affect mainly the product lines, right? what people can actually wear and can go buy. Rick has really shifted his mindset to glamour, lavishness, and these really loud pieces. And for a lot of the people who really enjoyed these monastic, disciplined, and comparatively minimalist pieces, this is definitely frustrating. Don't get me wrong, me personally, I love a lot of the loud pieces he produces. And I've worn my fair share of a lot of very loud pieces. But at the same time, you also need those dialed back pieces. It sort of feels like Rick is just kind of force feeding us crazy statement piece after crazy statement piece. On top of that, there's that whole part about like fitting a sandwich into the pocket and the whole practicality side of Rick clothes. And that has definitely gone out the window the most. He definitely has not put the same attention of detail into making sure that these pieces are at least somewhat practical and don't hinder somebody's lifestyle. A lot of the pieces he's produced these days are frankly uncomfortable, impractical, and you really can't wear day to day. They're for sure great for Fashion Week and are conceptually cool and look cool, but again, not for this whole customer base of people who loved him for the pieces they could wear day to day. He also really prioritized silhouettes that only fit ultra skinny people, which definitely isolated the fitness and bodybuilding community that he had gained over the years. It just becomes abundantly clear that Rick isn't looking to make items that the customer falls in love with beyond an aesthetic point. Now, Rick, of course, hasn't completely stopped making these staple pieces or completely isolated his original audience. The Dark Shadow line still tries to appease these people. While Dark Shadow still definitely feels like it hits this more consumer-friendly point, it's starting to feel like it doesn't represent that refined philosophy as much as it just aims to be easily consumable. Look, everything is bittersweet, right? Because the truth of the matter is as an artist and as a creative, Rick is at his best right now in this new era, but he isn't making the clothes or the products that I fell in love with and hitting the sensibilities that I fell in love with. Every era will have its positives and negatives. And while it's great to acknowledge all the amazing and limitless innovation and creativity that Rick is currently pursuing, it's also okay for me to say, frankly, I miss the old Rick. Clothes that felt like they were a perfect balance of avant-garde, yet also strangely practical. And of course, I'm not the only one who shares this sentiment. I'm sure there will be tons of people in the comments who also miss the old Rick. And I'm sure there will be many people who also love the new. But this is just my thoughts. It's been my musing for the past couple of weeks. Please subscribe. Again, my name is Carson Craning. Thank you for watching this YouTube video, and I'll see you again.